Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Around the Table with the AOTR. Today, we are stepping into the atmospheric, the psychological, and the deeply intoxicating. Our guest is an author whose work feels like a fever dream you don't want to wake up from, with just this really alluring quality I can't quite put into words, but it is really amazing. So, Wren Valentino, the mind behind Ambrosia and Mesmerize, welcome to the table.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here. I really appreciate it.
Yes, and Wren, just to let you know, your writing has this magnetic, almost haunting quality to it. It's just fantastic.
So, to start us off, your titles, Ambrosia and Mesmerized, both suggest a loss of control or a deep surrender to something. What is it about the uncontrollable parts of human desire that draws you to the page?
Such a wonderful question. And thank you, Beverly, for the kind words about my writing as well. I love the word uncontrollable because that to me feels a little bit unpredictable. And I think readers love an unpredictability, both in plot and character. I feel like in those moments of deep human desire is really where we get story, of course, but we really get character. And that's really what I was wanting to delve deep into in both of those novels, Ambrosia and Mesmerized, was in those moments of a loss of control or deep surrender to something much larger than the character, in those moments of revelation for the characters themselves, not only did I get to know them better as the author creating them on the page, but they got to know themselves better. And it really allowed me to really explore the complexities of both of my female characters, leading characters in both of those novels in a really cool way as a writer.
Sounds like that worked out really well for you. And, ambrosia, speaking
Yes.
of, is often associated with the food of the gods or something that grants
Mhm.
immortality. In your story, is that immortality a gift or is it a curse for the characters involved?
Well, the character believes that she's immortal, but she's really not. So there's this kind of dichotomy that's going on there for sure. I loved as you mentioned, the sort of association with the word itself being nectar of the gods, food of the gods, and so forth. I'm a big Greek mythology admirer of all things Greek mythology, and so that definitely finds its way into my work sometimes. Not as often, probably, as I would want it to, and not because of any other reason other than just story and what I'm writing. But the curse that my character Ambrosia is sort of met with, if you will, is that she doesn't believe that true love or the power of love exists and finds out through the novel that it indeed does, which I think is when she starts to realize that she's not as immortal as she thought she was because she's weakened to the power of love.
So, we talk about reclaiming voices here a lot. Do your characters find their voice through their obsessions, or do they lose themselves entirely to the ambrosia of their lives?
It's a great question. Both. I think I love what you had just said about finding their voice, especially through obsession. I write a lot about obsession. It's certainly a common theme. I feel like as a writer, I'm really tasked with, putting my character under considerable circumstances so that losing of themselves creates story arc, that they go from a version of themselves in the first few chapters of the novel to a revised, different version of themselves by the end of the book. And I think it's that journey, that losing themselves, finding their voice, dealing with their obsessions and their human desire. That's what fascinates me the most as the writer. And the architecture, the blueprint of a novel for me in the details of creating that is really about finding those moments of I don't know if I would say weakness, but I would say discovery of my characters, even my supporting characters as well, but certainly my main characters. And I love, the idea of reclaiming voice because that means that the voice is threatened or has been threatened in some way. And that's an opportunity for a character to rise to the occasion, to advocate for themselves and their voice. And I love that, both as a reader and a writer.
So, moving to Mesmerized,
Yes.
there's heavy focus on influence and psychological pull.
Yes.
How do you build tension in a way that makes the reader feel as under the spell as the characters themselves?
Well, I do think that that's a challenge. I will be honest. I think that as a writer, for me, I'm constantly looking for how to create that sense of tension on the page, not just in an authentic way, but in a way that makes sense to story and character. I love a good psychological story, especially a good psychological thriller. And the key to success in that genre is what you're talking about, is creating the building, the momentum of tension and as it grows. How do I do that? I really lean into two things a lot. I lean into place. I use the setting to create tension of where my character is in that moment. And I use imagery. And what I mean by imagery, especially, is I dig in when I'm creating tension on the page or something that's psychological or supernatural or paranormal. I dig deep into both place, but also those senses, the five senses, six if you're lucky, and use those senses to describe the place and the impact it has on the character themselves. And then I create an element that's either out of place or unusual or different to that place, or the senses notice something is different. And that's really where I start to plant the seeds for the impact of tension and so forth. As far as creating that so that the character feels sort of under the spell, or no pun intended, mesmerized by the characters, that's always the goal as a writer, as the person behind the craft. And certainly that's probably the element that is the most revised in subsequent versions of the novel past that first draft.
Yes, it certainly feels like the reader is a participant in the obsession, not just an observer in this book.
Right. Yeah. No, it is. And thank you for noting that, Beverly. Yeah. That's certainly an important element to that particular.
So many writers are afraid to look at the shadow parts of their own psyche. How much of Wren Valentino is hidden in the darker, more manipulative corners of your antagonist?
Well, my antagonists I'll be honest, are my favorite characters, maybe not necessarily in terms of my fondness for them, because my main characters have served me very, very well over the course of my career. But the antagonists for me are more fun to write for exactly the reasons that you're talking about, is that it allows me to go deeper, darker, creepier, if you will, all the things that kind of, are hidden beneath the surface. And I think a good antagonist, going back to that unpredictability factor, is we don't know what that antagonist is going to do next, which also creates tension. So I absolutely love diving deep into the shadowy parts of the antagonist psyche, which does often require me, as you're asking, to dive into my own. I do feel like that along the lines of an antagonist is an opportunity for me to incorporate those elements and so forth. Although I have had a couple of pretty dark psyche kind of main characters as well, depending on story. But yeah, that's such a great question. I love a good villain. I mean, who doesn't? But they're so fun to write and watch and read. And often they're the character that really resonates and we remember a lot too, especially depending on what kind of damage they create.
So, is writing these stories a way for you to purge your own fears, or is it a way to invite the reader to face theirs?
I think both. I really think both. And a good story, I think, does both for reader and author. And I think that's where the connection comes in. Sometimes that readers feel really connected to the author behind the story. And I feel like for me, at least in reader feedback and messages I've received on social media and so forth from my readers, who are very near and dear to me, as you can imagine. But they talk a lot about how that certain elements of the book either made them uncomfortable or got them out of their comfort zone, but they enjoyed that because it was part of the journey and the experience of reading the book. But for me, myself, it is writing, of course, is very therapeutic and very cathartic, but it's also it's an opportunity for us to dig into the other versions of ourselves. And certainly fear is a big part of that too. And there is some purging, I think, that comes along with when a novel is done. You do feel a sense of, well, exhaustion, but you also feel a sense of completion and a sense of like a part of you has been exposed and shared and even refueled often too. And it's often that part that feels the scariest to show, if you will.
So, your settings aren't just backgrounds, they feel alive and often dangerous. How do you go about world building in a contemporary or psychological setting to make the environment feel like a predator?
Ooh, that's a great story. I have, not to jump books, but I have a horror novel, spooky novel, scary novel coming out just in time for the Halloween festivities this year. And the setting was so critical to me. I placed it in a small desert town in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, because I wanted that sparse, almost lifeless landscape to echo the horrific acts that were happening in the story. And as I mentioned earlier, setting is so, so important to me as a writer. I try to find multi-purposes for every setting that I choose. And when I place a book, where I decide to place a story or shift to a different setting, so forth. Settings to me are really an extension of character. Because when you think about a setting and how a character responds to the setting or doesn't respond to the setting in some instances, it says so much about that character. And so I think that there's a really beautiful synergy between character and place. And certainly world building is so important in creating, contemporary psychological writing. And I love the idea that you had said about the environment feels like a predator. And I don't know if that's always my clear goal, like if it's at the forefront, but I am thinking about how to take a setting and sort of turn it upside down in a really interesting, often creepy way. And that just makes for more fun for me as a writer, quite honestly.
So, on the heels of that, does the
Mhm.
location of a story dictate the ending for you, or do the characters fight against the setting?
Good character always fights against the setting if you've developed them well enough. I love it when a character surprises me on the page. I've got plans for them and they fight back and say, no, I'm doing this instead. And more often than not, I'll go with it. But the location of the story, when I start a story, short story, or a novel, I work backwards. I know how the thing is going to end, and then I work my way backward as an author in the planning process of a novel, especially chapter by chapter kind of outline. And I work back to that beginning image. And so I will have an ending first and then a beginning. And in the middle is the exploration for me. But the location of a story is so significant in everything I've written. And it is often the thing that I hear back the most, either from critics, reviewers, or from readers as well, about how specific the location was, how the location, the place worked well in the story, and why. And so when I'm choosing a location, it's almost like you're auditioning in your mind as a writer, different locations to find the perfect fit for that story. And so I'll try a couple of different locations sometimes if I'm not sure. And if it's not working, I abandon the place very quickly and then go to my next choice.
So, in a world of safe and marketable stories, you write
Mhm.
things that are edgy and challenging. How do you protect your authentic, creative voice from the pressure to fit into a specific genre box?
Excellent thing to think about for sure as a writer. In addition to writing, I also teach. So I'm trying to think of like what would I tell my students. But I think genre is a guide, but should not be a barrier. Like a genre, there is certain expectations within a genre: paranormal, supernatural, thriller, horror, all those types of different. They're expectations of things that will happen, right? A cozy mystery. You have some expectations going into the novel or the story of elements that should live there and be there. And so I definitely make sure that those boxes are checked from a genre place. But I take that pressure, as you will, to fit in. I don't think about market. I don't think about audience. I just think about telling the best, most creative story I possibly can from beginning to end. Does that work for me or against me? Probably both, quite honestly. You know, but publishing is of course a business, it's an industry, so there are elements you need to consider during the overall journey of the novel. But I dismiss those kind of expectations while I'm writing the novel because I don't want to create barriers for myself as an author and then trip over those barriers and then the story suffers because of it. So I want to make sure that I'm writing from such a absolute place of truth from beginning to end, the truth that works for that particular story and those characters. But I love what you said about safe and marketable. And yes, my work is absolutely edgy and challenging. My novel, Marijuana Mermaid, which is a young adult novel, which has a little bit of sort of horror thriller kind of gothic element to it in the subplot, was a tough sell, because I'm writing about high school students that are involved in some more sort of, not appropriate behavior in terms of, as sometimes teenagers do. And I remember when we were shopping that book, that the Marijuana Mermaid, going back to the edgy and challenging, I stuck to that edgy and challenging. I had many potential agents and publishers along the way that encouraged me to soften the book to make it more marketable. and safe, as you had mentioned earlier. And I didn't do that because I wanted to stay true to the story. These were edgy three female characters that were exploring some things in their lives that were considered edgy and challenging. And it was part of who they were and part of their journey and so forth. So I stuck to it. We had about 100 different no's on that novel. And finally, all female publishing company in Los Angeles found the book, published the book, and the book it was my 11th novel, and in the first 2 months of the release of the book, it outsold all 10 of my previous novels collectively. And what people responded to was the edgy and challenging element of the story and the characters. So I am a stickler as a teacher, as a writer, as all the things that I am, that to thine own self be true, and do not waver. Do not waver. It is your story. There is room in the world, in the literary world, for edgy and challenging things. It's actually needed. It's necessary. I think edgy and challenging can often translate to uncomfortableness. And I think it's in the uncomfortable place that people learn more about themselves, who they are, in the world around them. And I'm happy to be a voice in that arena. But for sure, I don't think I would fit in, as you said, that phrase, fit in. I don't think I would fit in any specific genre box because I write in multiple genres, but two, I love breaking rules. I know the rules well enough now that at this point in my career that breaking them is the joy for me at writing often. Not that I set out for like shock value. I think that's a little bit different and more intentional than edgy and challenging. Edgy and challenging feels much more authentic to me. And certainly, I've written 25 novels and I'd say 23 of those would be described in some capacity as edgy and challenging. And I own that with pride, 100%.
That's awesome. That sounds like a really incredible book, to be honest, right up my alley.
Good. Well, if you read it, let me know. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's a fun. But it's very close to becoming a television series right now. We are waiting.
That's awesome.
So we are hoping, and I would love to get. It's a very diverse book in terms of ethnicity as well, and I'd love to be able to be a part of, in some way, some really important representation for young women, especially. So if I can have some small hand in that, let's do it.
Well, everybody, you heard it. We need to manifest, pray, whatever it is you do, that happens.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
So, what has been the most surprising reaction you've received from a reader who felt mesmerized by your work?
That's such a compelling thought. Anytime anybody responds to anything that I've written, such a gift. It is an absolute beautiful gift. As a writer, it's one of the greatest joys, if you will, of writing is hearing back from readers. I feel like there's a couple things that come to mind. One is a surprising reaction. One of the things I think that surprised me most was who was reading my novels. We talked about genre earlier, and I don't write all young adult, but I do write a considerable amount of young adult. And it's always interesting when I do book signings or literary festivals, that type of thing. I meet readers in person, and they're often older women that are reading my young adult novels, 40s and 50s and upward, which I appreciate very much. And there's a part of them or their younger self that connects with an element of the story. And I think early in my career, that was very surprising to me in terms of like who was actually connecting and reading the book versus who I thought would respond to the books well. I think I will mention here, I'm incredibly grateful to librarians, especially high school librarians, who have been key in not only finding my books and supporting my books in really wonderful ways, but connecting young readers, often reluctant readers, to books like Marijuana Mermaid and so forth. Mesmerized, certainly. The American Library Association was very good to that book, as were librarians and continue to be. That has been very surprising. But, when I hear from a reader that shares with me that they connected with something in the book that maybe was not intentional for me, but it was there, that they brought their experiences to the reading experience and they had a moment of discovery about self or something of that nature that felt bigger than them or felt comforting or felt, in some way reflected who they were and are. That never stops surprising me, quite honestly. And I love that very much. I love hearing from readers always, because that's who I'm writing for and creating for myself too, of course. But definitely in the end, an author really has this beautiful dynamic, if they're lucky, with their readers. And I certainly do. And I'm very grateful for that. And I love that I have readers across very wide spectrum, right? Like we couldn't put all of my readers into one box, which I love about that. It really depends on genre and novel and so forth. But yeah. And I live for those elements of surprise. So whenever it happens, I'm there for it.
So there is a lot of vulnerability and surrender. In your
Mm.
books, is surrender a sign of weakness, or is it the only way the characters can truly find out who they are?
I love those moments of surrender, whether they're giving up to their circumstances, they're surrendering to desire, they're surrendering to not they're the surrender for me is always a positive thing, or I work at it eventually that'll be that good comes from surrendering. And that when I say surrendering, I don't mean giving up necessarily, but I mean I think we're on the same page when we're talking about this version of surrendering, but the idea of vulnerability. And then I think in those moments of vulnerability, for one, again, readers get to know the character and the character gets to know themselves. But I feel like vulnerability in the most vulnerable moments in a novel, that is where the connection really deepens between reader and character. So those vulnerable moments typically are the ones that resonate a lot with readers, and they're often when those elements are what I usually hear back the most about. It also challenges the character. I think surrendering under sign of weakness could be viewed as a flaw. I certainly write flawed characters because they're much more interesting. But I also feel like surrendering a part of self is also a growth. It is absolutely, that's where growth happens with the character. It also makes for a much more interesting story, right? When you think about it, like to have a character that never has that vulnerable moment of giving up a part of themselves for the greater good or whatever it is. If we didn't have those moments, I don't know if the story would be as compelling. And that's always something I set out to do when I start writing a new project, is to create something that's compelling on page as much as I can.
So, how do you handle the emotional hangover that comes with writing such intense psychological scenes?
I watch a lot of I Love Lucy. I that's such a that I'm also an actor, and so I feel like it's about sort of disconnecting, which is sometimes so hard to do. There's been more than a few times that I've scared myself when I was writing something on the page, and I had to, get up and walk around and shake it off. But the emotional hangover does occur. I feel like, as a writer, if we're authentically describing mood, emotions, feelings, vulnerability, all those things on page, we've got to tap into that well ourselves to be able to accurately portray it. And it is difficult. I feel like I often feel the emotions that my characters are feeling from scene to scene. And so at the end of the day, at the end of a book, especially at the end of a book, when it's done and sent to my editor, it can be like an emotional hangover for sure. I've had a couple of books that were really hard to shake, Mesmerized being one of them, because there was a lot of my younger self in that book because of when it was set and where it was set was very close to my own younger life. That book in particular, because of how the book ends, of course, on an element of hope. But the journey that my character goes through is very emotionally wrought and has many complexities of different emotions in it. And that was a tough one to sort of shake and step away from. It took me a few months to do that. But in terms of the how, I joke about watching funny things, but cartoons and sitcoms can be your best friend, or can be a writer's best friend, especially if you're writing darker stuff, heavier stuff, spooky stuff, whatever it might be for that author. But that's what works for me. I will often, during the writing process, I work in breaks, both within the day and within the novel, to have time away from the story for that very reason, to have a little bit a stronger handle on balance. When I first started writing my first few books, I just wrote straight through and didn't build in those breaks. And then I found, as I started writing more and more, I recognized the need for those breaks, definitely on an emotional level, but just on a like refueling of creative energy level as well. So I go and have conversations with people, go to the grocery store, whatever I needed to do, take a weekend drive somewhere just to kind of refuel. And also too, when you're in the throes of creativity, especially when you're writing a book, which is all in, it's every part of you is in that process. psychologically, physiologically, the whole bit. It gives you a chance to kind of recharge that battery a little bit, but it also, because you're so creatively alert and aware, I think you're in hyper story mode. So the world you experience a little bit differently, even during those breaks. So you come back to the story with a renewed sense of story ideas that you might not have discovered if you weren't in that creative zone.
So, a good psychological story relies on the pivot the moment
Mhm.
everything changes. Do you plot those twists out with surgical precision or do they surprise you as you write?
I do both. I set out with I wouldn't say surgical precision because I think then I'm almost writing under duress at that point, and that's how it would feel for me. I'm definitely a plotter, but I do allow that open breathing space, often determined by character, sometimes supporting characters. For example, in my young adult novel Swimming to Chicago, I had which is a young adult. I had a supporting character, one of the moms, one of the mothers of one of the main characters. And just started writing more and more and more and more about her because she was demanding it. Now, of course, when I turned the novel in, my editor was like, this novel is not about her. We're going to have to cut about 50 pages of her. But I needed to write that to be able to fully develop the story and her relationship with the main character, who's her son. So I do allow that breathing space and that surprise element. And again, that's really where I rise to the occasion as a writer because I love those moments of surprise. Like I think I'm gonna go this way, and something about the story takes a different turn, and I let it do that. I've never fought that, thankfully, because it's in those surprises where the story becomes better, I feel. Then it's because the story then isn't like predetermined, right? It's coming from a natural flow as opposed to a planned flow. And I feel like, again, it just travels back to authenticity.
So, speaking of planning versus letting things happen, what
Mhm.
is the one trope in psychological thrillers or gothic fiction that you are currently on a mission to subvert or destroy?
Well, I love, love, love Gothic fiction. That is absolutely my first love. I think sometimes when I struggle with that is the depiction of female characters, sometimes in Gothic fiction, of needing to be saved or rescued from the castle, the mansion, the spooky house, the creepy guy, whatever it is. And so I am so determined. I write a lot of female characters, obviously, first
The
person female.
damsel in distress.
Right. And I veer away from that because that's not an interesting character for me to write, right? I don't want to be I mean, certainly I want a beautiful character, but I don't want a beautiful character sitting around in an evening gown waiting for, somebody to show up to tell her that she's this or that or determine her fate. I want her to be doing all of those things. That's definitely, I think, I love the history of Gothic fiction and how those very important books have gotten us to where we are today in contemporary Gothic fiction. I think you absolutely have to look back in order to move forward. So in Gothic fiction, that would definitely be a thing. Psychological thrillers, I'm wanting to bring more and more characters that we don't necessarily associate with a psychological thriller, right? Like somebody that just doesn't like their occupation is in no way, something we would expect in a psychological thriller, right? And I'm trying to really be mindful of like if it's already been done or told, like if I'm writing especially a psychological thriller and I feel like I've already read it or seen it, I stop because I really don't want to retell or retread. I want to add to that or that genre with a newness, something that telling a story in a way that has not been told before. That's a challenge for sure, considering the volume of work that exists in the literary world canon. But that's something I really would like to do with psychological thrillers is bring in characters that you would not expect based on genre and turn those tropes upside down as much as I possibly can.
After Ambrosia and Mesmerized, where is your
Mhm.
mind taking us next? Are we staying in the psychological realm, or are you looking to explore a different kind of darkness?
So that's a very, very exciting question. Yes, I am actually writing a novel right now about a female serial killer called Blood Bouquet, and she's obsessed with weddings and becoming a bride. And it is, and she's of course challenged by a female police officer, and it's sort of a cat and mouse between the two. But I'm really enjoying digging into the psychology, the mindset of a female serial killer. I don't mean to keep bringing up genre or gender, because I could just say serial killer, but the assumption would be if I said that the character's male. So that's why I'm bringing up genders, just to make the distinction, because we haven't had enough books, I feel, or movies or anything about, women who kill. And that's certainly something that is fascinating me enough to write a novel about it. So that's what I'm working on currently. I'm also working on a screenplay called Executive, which is almost done, about a woman who she works in an office building and discovers a portal sort of that takes her into that same office about 30 years previous. And in that world, she's the CEO versus being the nobody on the chain ladder. And in order to sustain that level of importance, she has to do some pretty horrible things to her coworkers. So it's kind of like an office horror movie. So we'll see how it goes. It might not go anywhere, but again, another female character that's sort of unpredictable and so forth. And I'm really fascinated with the idea of discovering a portal and using it in a really creepy way, as opposed to like a more romantic, nostalgic way. I'm all for those too, but for this particular project. So those are the two things I'm currently working on, with a couple of other side projects going on, and a couple of my stage play. I also write stage play called Better Places to Go, which is pretty dark. Was adapted into a film by a wonderful filmmaker named Adam Michael, which finished. They shot it on location in Ohio last year, and it'll be premiering on Amazon later this fall. So we're very excited about that. So, and I wasn't really involved in the film itself, but other than the fact that I was consulted about the script and so forth, and got to read the script, which was very true to my play. I was very appreciative. But there's some pretty dark and intense stuff, definitely psychological thriller. So I hope everybody gets to check it out. It's called Better Places to Go. I wrote the play, no kidding, 20 years ago. So for the writers out there listening, you never know when something you wrote years ago is going to come back around. And this filmmaker happened to discover my play and reached out and said, I really want to turn this into a film. And we talked, and I said, let's do it. And now it's, done, and will be out in the world very soon. So very excited about
That is incredible. I love hearing that, Ren. So, on the
you.
heels of that incredible announcement, I actually have to ask you if you could
Mhm.
give one piece of advice to a writer who is currently too afraid to write their own shadow story, what would that be?
I think it's really easy for me to say, write what you feel, and all those kind of things that writers usually tell people. I would encourage somebody who feels too afraid to write their own shadow story, that fear itself, and figure out how that fear can help inform the story that they're writing, as well as their creative process as an author. I think one of the biggest dangers for a young writer, young meaning like not necessarily in age, but young in their career, like they're just starting out. And you can start being an author when you're 85. There's no starting, there's no expiration or no starting kind of thing for when you have to become a writer. One, you've got to turn off that inner critic, the voice that's saying that you're no good, or you're going to be judged, or whatever the fact it is. You're already entering into a vulnerable zone just by being a storyteller and owning that in a really, really great way. But I would say always, always, always to write for yourself first, and make that the most important part of the writing process, is that you're telling that story for you. Somebody else reads it, it gets published, all those things happen, even better. But at the end of the day, you've got to write the story for yourself. All those other things are wonderful to happen, and they will happen, especially if you write a story from a place of truth. I think it's okay to be scared when you're writing. I think that you should welcome that fear, because what you're doing is a very brave thing. Anytime you sit down at a computer or a piece of paper or wherever, however you're writing, and you embrace that process and you make that commitment to tell the story, you're already that much more ahead than somebody who didn't even sit down to put one word on a piece of paper, right? So, and I don't think we need to be self-congratulatory, like, "Whoa, look at me, I'm writing." But I think that it's really important to acknowledge yourself, that what you're doing is so unique, both in form and craft and in all the things, right? And the creative life is not conventional, and it's scary itself to navigate, but it's so rewarding. It's absolutely so rewarding. So I would encourage anybody to face that fear, use that fear, and it gets less scary. It gets less scary the more you do it.
I agree with that. Wren, thank you so much for inviting us into your world. This has been a fascinating and deeply immersive interview.
And to
Thank
our
you
listeners,
very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
grab ambrosia and mesmerized. Let yourself be pulled in. Just remember, find your way back out. You can follow Wren on social media and check out their latest updates.
And to those listening, remember, radical love is the only way through. Donate to mutual aid, love your neighbors, and remember, we are the authors of the resistance.
Good night, everyone.